"You should pay your brother's rent," Elaine Collins said calmly across the Sunday dinner table, as if she were asking Margaret to pass the salt. The words settled into the quiet dining room and stayed there, heavy and unmoving. Margaret Collins, 67 years old, widow, retired bookkeeper, folded her napkin carefully beside her plate and looked at her mother without blinking. The roast chicken sat untouched in front of her, steam fading into the air of the tidy suburban Ohio home she had grown up in, the same house where she had once done her homework at this very table while Daniel, 3 years younger and perpetually excused, played outside. Robert Collins cleared his throat but did not disagree with his wife. Daniel stared at his phone, scrolling as though the outcome were already decided. "It's only $1,400 a month," Elaine continued, her tone measured, reasonable. "You sold your house. You have savings. Your brother just needs a little help getting back on his feet." Margaret let the silence stretch. She had learned long ago that silence made people reveal more than arguments ever could. Daniel had been getting back on his feet for over 2 decades, after a failed landscaping business, after a credit card default, after a brief attempt at real estate that dissolved in less than a year. Each time, someone else had steadied him. Usually her. She remembered co-signing his auto loan at 45, writing a check to cover his security deposit at 52, wiring $3,000 when his utilities were cut off one winter. Each time, it had been framed as temporary. Each time, it had become expected. Elaine reached for her water glass. "You've always been the responsible one, Margaret. That's why we're asking you." Responsible. The word landed like a quiet verdict. Margaret had paid off her mortgage early. She had worked 35 years without missing a payment. She had cared for her husband through 2 surgeries before he passed, managing medications, insurance claims, and every small detail of daily life without complaint. When she finally listed her 3-bedroom colonial last month, it wasn't out of impulse. It was strategy. The house had sold in 9 days. The proceeds had been transferred into an account in her name alone. She had signed the closing documents without telling a soul at this table. Daniel looked up at last. "It's not forever," he said, offering a small shrug. "Just until things stabilize." Margaret studied her brother's face, the faint crease of expectation between his eyebrows. She saw no embarrassment there, no urgency. Only assumption. She reached for her purse, withdrew a folded envelope, and placed it beside her plate without opening it. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue about fairness or past sacrifices. Instead, she offered a small, almost pleasant smile. "Great," she said evenly. "He can have your house." Elaine frowned, confused. Robert leaned forward. Daniel finally set his phone down. Margaret's smile did not change. "I sold mine." The silence that followed felt different from before. Not heavy. Not resigned. It felt clean. Elaine's fingers tightened around her glass. "What do you mean you sold it?" Robert asked. Margaret lifted her gaze and met her father's eyes. "It closed last week." No anger colored her tone. No triumph either. Just fact. Outside, a lawnmower droned in a neighboring yard, steady and ordinary, as if nothing remarkable had happened at this table. But something had shifted. For the first time in decades, Margaret was not the solution to someone else's crisis. She was simply a woman who had made a decision without asking permission. And in the quiet that followed, that was what unsettled them most. Margaret did not stay for dessert. She rose from the table with the same unhurried composure she had carried through tax seasons, hospital waiting rooms, and long nights balancing accounts when money had been tight. She thanked her mother for dinner, placed her chair back exactly where it had been, and walked out into the mild Ohio evening air as if nothing unusual had taken place. The sky was turning the pale blue of early dusk, and the neighborhood smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. She drove 20 minutes north, past the strip mall where she used to buy Daniel school supplies when he forgot them, past the church where her husband's memorial service had been held, and toward the small condominium community where she had signed a 12-month lease under her own name. The unit was 900 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, no stairs, no yard to maintain. It was not impressive, but it was intentional. She parked in her assigned space and sat in the quiet car for a moment before turning off the engine. Her phone vibrated almost immediately. First her mother, then her father, then Daniel. She let all 3 calls go to voicemail. Inside the condo, the air conditioner hummed steadily. The living room still smelled faintly of new paint. Her furniture had been delivered 2 days earlier, a modest gray sofa, a small oak dining table for 4, the same antique dresser she had kept from the house. She set her purse down on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. Only then did she press play on the first voicemail. Elaine's voice sounded sharper than it had at dinner. "Margaret, you cannot make decisions like this without talking to us. Selling your home is drastic." The second message from Robert was calmer, but carried the same disbelief. "Call us back. We need to discuss what this means." The third was from Daniel. "So where am I supposed to go if things fall apart?" There was no apology in his tone, only anxiety about his own future. Margaret placed the phone face down on the counter. For years she had believed that keeping peace required explanation. That if she just clarified her reasoning enough, everyone would understand. But peace had always meant compliance. She walked to the second bedroom, the one she had arranged as a small office, and opened the drawer of the simple white desk. Inside lay a folder containing the closing statement from the sale of her 3-bedroom colonial. After taxes and fees, the proceeds had been wired directly into a newly established trust, managed by an advisor she had met quietly 3 months earlier. The trust listed one beneficiary, Margaret Collins. Not Daniel. Not Robert. Not Elaine. She had reviewed the documents line by line, the way she once reviewed corporate ledgers, making sure there were no loopholes, no assumptions. The decision had not come from anger. It had come from pattern recognition. She thought of the winter Daniel called claiming his landlord was threatening eviction. She had transferred $2,000 within the hour. Weeks later, she learned he had used half of it for a down payment on a new television. She thought of the time her parents insisted she contribute to Daniel's business idea, assuring her it was an investment in family. The business had dissolved within 6 months. No one had repaid her. When her husband was ill, Daniel had visited twice. Each visit had ended with him hinting at his own financial stress. Margaret sat down at the small dining table and looked around the condo. It was quiet. No one else had keys. No one had expectations tied to its walls. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered. "Margaret," Elaine began, her voice tight, "this is not how family works." Margaret leaned back in her chair and glanced at the closed folder on the desk. "It is exactly how it works now," she replied, her tone even, measured, and entirely certain. Elaine's words lingered long after the call ended, but Margaret did not feel shaken. She placed her phone back on the table and walked to the narrow balcony attached to her condominium. The parking lot lights flickered on one by one, casting pale yellow circles across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and a car door slammed. Ordinary sounds. Predictable. Unlike the rhythm of her family's expectations. The next morning, she woke before 6 as she always had, even in retirement. Habit was not something she could sell along with a house. She brewed coffee in the small stainless steel machine she had purchased specifically for this space and stood at the kitchen counter instead of sitting. The condo felt different in the morning light, smaller but clearer, as though every object had purpose. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Daniel. "Mom and Dad are upset. You blindsided them." Margaret read it twice before setting the phone down. Blindsided. She considered the word carefully. For years, she had been the one adjusting her steps to avoid startling anyone else. When Daniel missed rent, she shifted funds. When her parents hinted about fairness, she rewrote her own budget. When her husband was ill, she managed his appointments and still attended family dinners where Daniel's struggles dominated the conversation. If anyone had been caught off guard, it was only because they had assumed she would remain predictable. Later that afternoon, Robert arrived unannounced at the condominium complex. Margaret saw his sedan pull into a visitor space from her balcony and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She walked downstairs before he could knock. He stood by the mailbox area, hands folded behind his back, as if he were about to deliver a lecture. "This is not like you," he said without greeting. Margaret offered a polite nod. "It is exactly like me," she replied. "It is careful. It is planned." Robert glanced around at the modest building, at the neatly trimmed shrubs and identical doors. "You worked your whole life for that house," he said. "Why give it up?" Margaret studied her father's face, the lines deeper than she remembered. "Because it was the only leverage anyone believed I had," she answered calmly. "As long as I owned something they could imagine using, I was responsible for solving their emergencies." Robert frowned. "Family helps each other." Margaret did not argue with the sentiment. Instead, she asked quietly, "How many times has Daniel helped me?" The question settled between them. Robert looked away first. He shifted his weight and cleared his throat, searching for examples that did not come. Margaret continued, not with anger but with clarity. She reminded him of the $2,000 she transferred 3 winters ago, of the loan she never saw repaid, of the afternoons she spent reviewing Daniel's resumes, rewriting them line by line. "I have helped," she said softly, "for 30 years. Robert exhaled slowly. "He just needs time." Margaret nodded once. "Then he will have time. Just not my house." There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Only boundaries drawn in steady lines. Robert looked at her as if seeing her differently, perhaps for the first time not as the dependable daughter, but as an independent woman. He left without pressing further. Margaret returned upstairs and closed the door behind her. The quiet that followed was not lonely. It was deliberate. For the first time, the weight of Daniel's future did not rest on her shoulders. It rested where it belonged. Margaret did not hear from Daniel for 3 days after her father's visit, and the silence told her more than any argument could have. On the 4th afternoon, as she was organizing kitchen drawers in her small condominium, her phone rang again. This time Daniel did not text. He called. She let it ring twice before answering, not to play games, but to steady her tone. "I stopped by your old place," he began without greeting. "The realtor sign is gone." Margaret closed the drawer carefully and leaned against the counter. "The closing was final," she replied. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low exhale. "You could have. Let me move in," Daniel said. "At least for a while." The statement was not framed as a request. It sounded like a missed entitlement. Margaret glanced around the condo, at the compact refrigerator, the small framed photograph of her late husband on the shelf, the single armchair by the window. For years she had imagined that house as stability. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a backyard large enough for summer barbecues. She had painted the shutters herself. She had planted the maple tree that now stood taller than the roof. But the longer she owned it, the more it had become symbolic, not of comfort, but of obligation. "You never asked to move in," she said evenly. "You assumed it would be available." Daniel did not deny it. Instead, he shifted tactics. "Mom and Dad are worried about you," he said. "They think you are isolating yourself." Margaret almost smiled at the phrasing. Isolation. As if distance from constant requests were a symptom rather than a choice. "I moved 15 miles away," she replied. "Not across the country." Daniel's tone sharpened slightly. "It just feels extreme." Margaret walked to the small dining table and ran her fingers along its smooth edge. Extreme would have been yelling at dinner. Extreme would have been listing every dollar she had ever given him. What she had done was quiet, measured, legal. "Do you remember when your landlord raised your rent 2 years ago?" she asked calmly. "I covered the increase for 6 months. Daniel hesitated. "I was in between contracts. And the year before that," she continued, "when your car needed repairs, I paid that bill as well." There was no accusation in her voice, only inventory. Silence stretched between them. She did not rush to fill it. Finally Daniel said, "I thought that is what family does." Margaret considered the statement carefully before answering. "Family supports," she said. "Family does not depend indefinitely on one person's stability." Daniel's breathing shifted, the faint sound of movement in the background suggesting he was pacing. "So that is it?" he asked. "You are just done helping?" Margaret looked toward the closed folder on her desk that contained the trust documents. She had not built that safety for indulgence. She had built it for peace. "I am done being the backup plan," she said quietly. The words were not harsh. They were firm. Daniel did not argue further. He ended the call with a brief goodbye that lacked its usual expectation of reassurance. After the line disconnected, Margaret remained seated for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner. She did not feel triumphant. She felt recalibrated. For decades, she had adjusted herself to maintain equilibrium in the family. Now the balance had shifted, not through confrontation, but through absence. Without her house as a fallback option, without her savings as an open reserve, Daniel would have to calculate his own next step. Margaret stood and walked to the window. In the parking lot below, a young couple carried grocery bags into their unit, laughing about something ordinary. Life continued, indifferent to her family's disappointment. And for the first time, that indifference felt liberating. The week that followed felt unfamiliar, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because nothing did. Margaret woke each morning without a message asking for money, without a subtle reminder of Daniel's rent cycle, without her mother's carefully phrased concern disguised as family unity. The quiet was not empty. It was spacious. On Thursday afternoon, she met with her financial advisor, Mr. Henderson, in a small office downtown with beige walls and framed certificates hung in symmetrical rows. She had scheduled the appointment months earlier, long before the dinner conversation. At that time, she had not yet sold the house, but she had already been calculating her exit from expectation. Mr. Henderson reviewed the trust documentation again, confirming the allocation of the proceeds from the sale. A conservative mix of municipal bonds and dividend stocks, structured to provide steady quarterly income. Enough to cover her condominium lease, utilities, groceries, health insurance premiums, and a modest emergency reserve. Margaret listened carefully, asking precise questions about tax implications and beneficiary clauses. When he mentioned the option of naming contingent heirs, she shook her head gently. "Not at this time," she said. The statement was not punitive. It was protective. After the meeting, she walked 3 blocks to a small cafe she had passed many times but never entered. She ordered a bowl of soup and a cup of coffee and sat by the window, observing people move through their own routines. For decades, she had eaten quickly between responsibilities, always aware of someone else's need waiting in the background. Today, there was no urgency. Her phone remained face down on the table. When she finally checked it, she found one message from Elaine. "We're having Sunday dinner as usual. We expect you there." The phrasing was deliberate. Expect. Margaret reread the sentence and considered her response carefully. She did not want distance to become hostility. She simply wanted clarity to remain intact. She typed slowly, choosing each word with the same discipline she once used balancing financial statements. "I will come on Sunday. I will not discuss Daniel's rent." She pressed send before she could soften the boundary. Sunday arrived cool and overcast. Margaret drove to her parents' house with steady hands. The maple trees along their street were beginning to turn early shades of orange, signaling a season shifting forward whether anyone felt ready or not. Inside, the dining table was set as always. Elaine moved between the kitchen and dining room with brisk efficiency. Daniel sat in his usual chair, his expression unreadable. Robert offered a nod but no lecture. The meal began with small talk about weather and grocery prices. Margaret participated without tension. She described her new neighborhood, the walking path near her building, the small library branch within a mile of her condo. She spoke of practical details, not defensively, simply factually. Halfway through dinner, Daniel cleared his throat. "I met with my landlord," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I am taking on extra shifts." It was not an apology, but it was movement. Elaine looked between her children as if measuring the distance that now existed. "We just worry about you being alone," she said softly. Margaret placed her fork down and met her mother's gaze. "I am not alone," she replied. "I am independent." The difference hung quietly in the room. Robert nodded once, perhaps in reluctant understanding. No one mentioned the house again. No one asked about her savings. For the first time in years, the dinner conversation did not revolve around Daniel's instability. It felt awkward at moments, but it was balanced. After the meal, Margaret stood to leave before dessert, not abruptly, simply on her own schedule. At the door, Daniel spoke more quietly than before. "I will figure it out," he said. Margaret studied her brother's face, searching for resentment. She saw uncertainty, but also the faint outline of responsibility forming where dependence once sat comfortably. She offered a small nod. "I believe you will." She stepped outside, into the cool evening air, and walked to her car without heaviness. The house behind her still stood in its familiar place, unchanged in structure, but altered in dynamic. Margaret started the engine and drove back toward her condominium, aware that nothing in her external world had become grander. The unit was still 900 square feet. The parking lot was still ordinary. The trust account did not make her wealthy. What had changed was subtler and more enduring. She was no longer the contingency plan. And in that absence, the family was beginning, however slowly, to reorganize itself around reality instead of assumption. 2 weeks after that dinner, Margaret noticed something she had not expected. The calls from her parents did not stop, but they changed in tone. They no longer carried instruction. They carried updates. On a Tuesday evening, as she folded laundry in her condominium bedroom, her phone rang and Elaine's voice sounded less certain than usual. "Daniel found a second job," she said, as if reporting weather. Margaret paused with a neatly folded towel in her hands. "That is good," she replied. There was a brief silence before Elaine continued. "He is working evenings at a warehouse distribution center. 12-hour shifts on weekends." The detail lingered in the air. Margaret could picture it easily. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights, pallets stacked shoulder high. She had spent decades in offices, balancing numbers that never argued back. Daniel, for the first time, was balancing physical labor against rent due dates. She did not celebrate it. She acknowledged it. "He will learn quickly," she said calmly. Later that week, Daniel called himself. His tone was different now, steadier but less defensive. "It is tiring," he admitted. "But I should have done it sooner." Margaret listened without interruption. She did not remind him that she had once suggested additional work when his hours were reduced years earlier. She did not mention the checks she had written to cushion him from fatigue. Instead, she asked, "How are you managing your budget?" Daniel explained that he had canceled 2 subscription services, sold a motorcycle he rarely used, and negotiated a payment plan with his landlord to catch up on overdue utilities. Each adjustment sounded practical, almost adult. Margaret felt something unfamiliar move through her chest. Not pride exactly. Relief. When the call ended, she walked to the small kitchen window and looked out at the parking lot below. A delivery truck idled near the curb, its driver unloading boxes one at a time. Nothing dramatic. Just work. Over the next month, the family dinners continued, but the atmosphere had shifted in subtle ways. Daniel spoke about scheduling, about overtime, about setting aside savings for emergencies. Robert asked questions about interest rates instead of offering rescue strategies. Elaine listened more than she directed. Margaret noticed the absence of one particular phrase. No one said, "Margaret will handle it." One Sunday evening, as the meal wound down, Robert cleared his throat and said quietly, "You are right to protect yourself." The statement was not loud, but it carried weight. Margaret met her father's eyes and nodded once. She did not frame it as victory. It was simply acknowledgement of reality. Driving back to her condominium that night, she thought about the house she had sold. The 3-bedroom colonial with the maple tree she had planted. She missed certain details. The creak of the hallway floorboard. The sunlight that used to fall across the kitchen counter at 5 in the afternoon. But she did not miss the invisible clause attached to it. Ownership had come with expectation. Space had come with assumption. In this smaller unit, her expenses were predictable. Her time was her own. She joined a morning walking group that met 3 times a week along a paved trail near the community center. The path measured exactly 1 mile end to end. She completed it twice each morning, sometimes 3 times when the weather was clear. The rhythm of her steps felt steady, self-directed. One morning, she received a text from Daniel while tying her sneakers. Paid rent in full this month. There was no request attached. No follow-up question. Just information. Margaret read the message and allowed herself a small smile before placing the phone back on the counter. She stepped outside into the cool air and began her walk. The sun rose slowly above the trees, indifferent to family dynamics, consistent in its pattern. For years she had believed that stepping back would fracture everything. Instead, it had forced alignment. Daniel was working. Her parents were adjusting. And Margaret, in 900 square feet of carefully chosen independence, felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt proportion. Her life no longer revolved around someone else's instability. It revolved around her own deliberate choices, measured and steady, like the quiet miles she walked each morning. By early October, the leaves along the walking trail had turned fully orange and gold, and Margaret noticed that her routines no longer felt like adjustments, but like ownership. She knew which neighbor left for work at exactly 7:30 each morning. She knew which corner of the trail caught the strongest wind. She knew how much her monthly expenses totaled down to the dollar. Stability, she had learned, was not the size of a house. It was predictability without obligation. One evening Daniel called again, but this time his voice carried something unfamiliar. "I opened a savings account," he said. Margaret sat at her small dining table with a cup of herbal tea cooling beside her. "That is responsible," she replied. Daniel explained that after covering rent and utilities, he had started setting aside $200 every month. It was not a large sum, but it was his. He mentioned meeting with a coworker who had suggested a basic budgeting spreadsheet. Margaret listened quietly, resisting the urge to offer detailed advice. For years, she had managed numbers for other people, adjusting columns to correct their mistakes. Now she understood that stepping in too quickly would undo the lesson. "Consistency matters more than amount," she said gently. Daniel was quiet for a moment before responding. "I used to assume you would always step in," he admitted. The sentence lingered longer than any apology could have. Margaret did not answer immediately. She remembered the countless evenings she had transferred funds without discussion. The way she had justified it as protection. The way her parents had praised her reliability while overlooking the imbalance it created. "I allowed that assumption," she said calmly. There was no accusation in her tone. Only acknowledgement. A week later, Robert invited her for coffee at a small diner halfway between their homes. He arrived early, already seated in a vinyl booth, stirring cream into his cup. Margaret slid into the opposite seat and studied her father's face. He looked older than he had a month ago, but also less rigid. "Your mother worries that things will never feel the same," he said quietly. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "They should not," she replied. "They should feel healthier." Robert looked down at the laminated menu before meeting her eyes again. "We leaned on you," he admitted. "Too much." The statement was simple. It carried no excuses. Margaret nodded once. She did not need a dramatic apology. Recognition was enough. After coffee, she returned to her condominium and spent the afternoon organizing a small bookshelf she had purchased. On the top shelf, she placed framed photographs, her wedding day, her husband smiling in the backyard of the old house, a childhood picture of Daniel holding a baseball glove too large for his hand. She studied that image for a long moment. He had not always been dependent. He had once been hopeful, determined. Somewhere along the way, comfort had replaced urgency. That comfort had been financed, quietly, by her. The following Sunday dinner felt different again. Daniel spoke about applying for a certification course that could increase his hourly wage. Elaine asked about Margaret's walking group. Robert mentioned minor repairs he needed to make to their own house. No one suggested that Margaret contribute. No one hinted at future obligations. At one point, Daniel looked across the table and said, "I should have handled my rent myself years ago." Margaret held his gaze steadily. "You are handling it now," she answered. The conversation moved on. Driving home that evening, Margaret felt the steady hum of her engine and the even rhythm of traffic lights turning green in sequence. She did not feel distant from her family. She felt appropriately placed within it. The role she had carried for decades had been heavy because it was undefined. Now it was clear. She was a sister. She was a daughter. She was not a safety net. Back in her 900 square feet of carefully chosen space, Margaret turned off the lights one by one and prepared for bed. Through the window, she could see the faint outline of trees against the night sky. Change had not shattered her family. It had recalibrated it. And for the first time, that recalibration included her. Winter arrived gradually, not with a single storm, but with a slow tightening of the air that made Margaret's morning walks shorter and her evenings quieter. The trees along the trail stood bare now, their branches thin and deliberate against a pale gray sky. She adjusted her routine without resistance. A heavier coat, gloves tucked into her pockets. 2 miles instead of 3 when the wind cut too sharply. Adaptation had never been her weakness. What had changed was the direction of her effort. In early December, Daniel invited her to see the small apartment he had moved into after negotiating a more affordable lease. It was not in the most desirable part of town, but it was clean. 800 square feet. Second floor. No balcony. Margaret climbed the narrow stairs carefully and stepped inside, noticing immediately the absence of clutter. A modest sofa. A compact dining table. No unnecessary purchases. Daniel seemed aware of her assessment. I sold a few things, he said, almost casually. Did not need them. Margaret nodded. She walked through the small space without commentary, running her hand lightly along the edge of the kitchen counter as if testing its solidity. It felt stable. Practical. In the living room, Daniel gestured toward a folder on the coffee table. I enrolled in that certification course, he said. It starts in January. There was no request attached. No expectation of tuition coverage. Margaret studied the brochure briefly. The course lasted 12 weeks and promised an hourly wage increase upon completion. That is a strong decision, she replied. Daniel met her eyes steadily. I wanted to do it on my own. The statement carried more weight than he likely realized. For years his independence had been theoretical, supported by her quiet interventions. Now it was visible, imperfect but real. As the holidays approached, Elaine suggested hosting Christmas dinner at her house as usual. This time, however, the tone of preparation felt different. There were no side conversations about financial strain. No subtle hints about who could contribute more. Each person brought something tangible. Robert prepared the turkey. Elaine baked pies. Daniel offered to cover groceries for side dishes. Margaret arrived with a simple green bean casserole and a bottle of sparkling cider. During dinner, conversation drifted toward ordinary topics. Weather forecasts. A new grocery store opening nearby. Daniel's upcoming course schedule. At one point Elaine looked at Margaret and said quietly, "You seem lighter." Margaret considered the comment before answering. "I am carrying what belongs to me," she said. Nothing more. Later that evening, as she stood at the kitchen sink drying plates, Daniel joined her. "I used to think you were being harsh," he admitted softly. "Now I think you were being honest." Margaret handed him a clean plate without turning it into a lecture. "Honesty feels harsh when it is new," she replied. The house was warm with the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey. Familiar walls. Familiar furniture. But the dynamic within them had shifted permanently. After dinner, Margaret drove back to her condominium through streets lined with modest holiday lights. The glow reflected softly against her windshield. She did not feel excluded from her family. She felt appropriately aligned within it. Inside her own small space, she turned on a single lamp and sat at her dining table with a cup of tea. She thought about the colonial house she had sold months ago, the echo of empty rooms on moving day, the assumption that had once tied her to it. She did not regret the decision. The square footage had shrunk. The weight had lifted. Her trust account continued to generate steady income. Her expenses remained predictable. More importantly, her relationships no longer revolved around her capacity to rescue. As midnight approached on New Year's Eve, fireworks sounded faintly in the distance. Margaret stood by the window and watched small bursts of color flare briefly against the dark sky. Change had not arrived with chaos. It had arrived with boundaries. And those boundaries had reshaped everything without breaking it. Spring arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, with thin lines of green pushing through the soil along the walking trail and longer stretches of sunlight slipping through Margaret's condominium windows in the early evening. By March, Daniel had completed half of his certification course. He called one Sunday afternoon while she was rearranging the small balcony plants she had purchased from a local nursery. "I passed the midterm exam," he said, his voice carrying something close to pride. Margaret adjusted a clay pot into the sunlight before responding. "That is progress earned," she replied. There was no need to embellish it. Daniel explained that his supervisor had hinted at a raise once the certification was finalized. He spoke in specifics now. Hourly rates, shift schedules, savings targets. The language of responsibility had replaced the language of rescue. Later that week, Margaret met her parents for lunch at a modest restaurant near their neighborhood. The hostess led them to a booth by the window, and for a moment Margaret observed them carefully. Robert moved slower than he had the previous year. Elaine's hair had grown thinner. Time was adjusting them as well. Over soup and sandwiches, conversation flowed without tension. Elaine asked about the walking group. Robert mentioned installing new gutters himself instead of hiring help. Daniel's name came up only briefly, framed by updates rather than concerns. At one point Elaine reached across the table and touched Margaret's hand lightly. "We underestimated you," she said quietly. Margaret considered the sentence before answering. "You relied on me," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." Elaine nodded without argument. On the drive back to her condominium, Margaret reflected on the months that had passed since that dinner conversation that shifted everything. The house she had sold no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a pivot. She had reduced square footage but increased proportion. She had removed herself as the automatic solution, and in doing so she had forced growth where it had long been postponed. In April, Daniel invited her to attend a small ceremony marking the completion of his course. The event took place in a rented conference room at the warehouse distribution center where he worked evenings. Folding chairs lined the walls. A simple banner congratulated the participants. When Daniel's name was called, he walked forward with steady steps and accepted a certificate printed on thick paper. Margaret watched from the second row. She did not clap louder than anyone else. She did not cry. She simply observed a man standing on his own effort. Afterward, Daniel approached her with a reserved smile. "I did not think I would finish," he admitted. Margaret looked at him evenly. "You finished because no one finished it for you," she said. The statement was not sharp. It was factual. Weeks later, Daniel informed her that his hourly wage had increased by $3. He had begun adding $300 a month to his savings account. Margaret listened carefully, noting the absence of desperation in his voice. She did not feel replaced. She felt released. On a warm Saturday in early May, Margaret walked her usual mile and then sat on a bench near the end of the trail. The trees were fully green now, their branches thick with new leaves. Children rode bicycles along the paved path. A breeze moved lightly through the air. She thought about the old colonial house, the maple tree she had planted decades earlier, and the invisible contract attached to its ownership. She had believed that selling it might fracture her family. Instead, it had rebalanced it. That evening, Daniel stopped by her condominium unannounced, but this time with a small box of pastries from a bakery near his apartment. He set them on her modest kitchen counter and looked around the 900 square feet without judgment. "It suits you," he said simply. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "It fits," she replied. They sat at the small dining table, no longer separated by expectation. Outside, the parking lot lights flickered on as the sun lowered behind the buildings. Margaret understood then that independence had not distanced her from her family. It had clarified her place within it. She was no longer the safety net stretched beneath someone else's uncertainty. She was a woman who had chosen proportion over pressure, balance over obligation, and in doing so, had given everyone else the chance to stand.